All right, welcome back to WMMA Now with your host Chuck Stevenson. So today I want to talk a little bit about the rankings and how certain fighters tend to get pushed, like big pushes up in the rankings and often very fast. Now, the UFC rankings, sometimes the UFC will use them, sometimes they won't. It really depends. Like if they're trying to push a fighter, then they'll market them sometimes using the rankings, sometimes not. The UFC president Dana White has often said that the rankings really don't matter. They don't really matchmake based on the rankings, and that they don't play a huge part in the matchmaking. But he often tends to contradict himself, because when he does his little if you don't know now you know vlogs, he'll talk about fighters' rankings and stuff like that. And the fact that the UFC will even put the rankings next to the fighters' names during the tells of the tape and in their marketing stuff tells you that sometimes the rankings do matter, particularly if they're trying to push a certain fighter. So if the UFC chooses to push a fighter, they tend to make it obvious in, several ways. First up, marketing. They start marketing a fighter hard. They start featuring them in little featurettes, doing like Road to the Octagon, pushing them more in their social media marketing, things of that nature. They also start to move that fighter up the rankings sometimes, and it's usually very fast, often several steps or more at a time. I mean, they might take a fighter who's completely unranked and put them up in against a top 10 fighter. So they'll move those fighters up the rankings very fast. And they'll also, said fighter that is receiving that push always fights up the rankings. They never fight to defend their position as long as they are receiving the push. The only time they might fight down is if their opponent that they're supposed to fight drops out and they have to take a short notice opponent. But for the most part, they're always fighting up the rankings, and which, granted, that is the goal. But sometimes you can't always do that. A lot of fighters get stuck defending their ranking spots for a while, whereas other fighters are getting, that constant push up the rankings. Also, fighters who are getting a push get frequent fights. They get scheduled more frequently than, honestly, most other fighters. You might see a fighter that you haven't heard a peep about in 6 months, whereas a fighter who just fought last week is already getting scheduled for a next fight in 2 or 3 months from now. So fighters getting a push, if they're starting to build up momentum and they're getting that push, they're going to fight more frequently. Now the push continues until the fighter loses. Sometimes it stops completely. I mean, like they lose, and depending on how they lose, the push just stops completely. Sometimes it picks back up after a tune-up fight. It really just depends on the fighter, whether the fan reaction to how they lose, things like that. Sometimes they'll get that tune-up fight, and then the push resumes again. Other times it's like the push just stops. Now sometimes the pushee, the fighter being pushed, sometimes it works out for them. I'm going to go through some examples, and there's one example on there who got a big push, and it worked out great for her. Other fighters, it really hurts them. And then some fighters that are getting the push right now, that the verdict is still out on them. The jury's still out. So sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes, other fighters, it's just hard to say right now. So let's look at several examples of fighters who have gotten that big push. Now, the first one is an example of what I would say as a failure. The second example is probably the biggest success story. And then the others, the jury is still out on them. So first up, let's talk about 12-gauge Paige Vanzant. So Paige got a big marketing push from the UFC pretty much immediately. She was on, I think, the second or third strawweight fight in the UFC before Tough 20 ended. Got a fight of the night win against Kylan Curry. Next fight up, she fought one of the tough 20 vets in Felice Herrig. And then after that, got another tough veteran in Alex Chambers. Won all three of those. Now, none of those fighters were in the top 10 of the division at the time. I certainly don't think Herrig was. Chambers definitely was not. So what do? They kept building that push for Paige Vanzant. Huge marketing campaign behind her. She was on like the Metro PCS commercials, Dancing with the Stars, stuff like that. What do? They move her all the way up to a top 5 fight against Rose Namajunas. Rose, who was a finalist on the Ultimate Fighter 20. Rose, who was on Paige Vanzant, who was just coming off a win. Only 2 fights after. I mean, this was only her second fight coming out of the Ultimate Fighter. So Rose completely dominates her throughout 4 rounds, and then in the 5th round chokes her unconscious. Or no, she tapped. I'm sorry. She did tap. So, boom. Big stop to the push right there. But not quite. Because they gave her a tune-up fight. They gave her Beck Rawlings. Paige was honestly losing that fight, and then came out with that switch kick and knocked Rawlings out. Got lucky on that one. So then they push her all the way back up into the rankings, or at least somewhat in the rankings. They give her Michelle Watterson. She loses to Michelle Watterson, again gets choked out, this time even faster in the 1st round. From there, the push for Paige Vanzant pretty much stopped. So that's a good example of a fighter where the push failed. So let's move on to argue easily the biggest success story for that big push. Zhang Weili. So Zhang comes into the UFC, takes on Danielle Taylor. Danielle Taylor, completely unranked, not known for being an exciting fighter at that time. Beats Danielle Taylor. Then she fights another unranked fighter in Jessica Aguilar. Now Aguilar at one time was one of the top strawweights, but that was before she got to the UFC and has, never showed anything worth showing in the UFC. Beats Jessica Aguilar, beats her up, arm bars her in the 1st round. Gets an exciting finish in front of her home crowd in China. I believe that was in China. Was that in China? Let me check. Oh, nope, that's on the wrong one. UFC Fight Night 141. Took place in Beijing, yeah. So that's when Zhang really got the push, was after beating Aguilar in Beijing. They give her a top 10 fight in Tecia Torres. Now Torres at the time, I believe, was on a two fight skid, but she was still well within the top 10. Zhang beats her. So she goes from not fighting any ranked fighters at all to getting a top 10 win. Or fighting a top 10 fighter and then getting that win. And then the next fight, she gets the title shot. So you go from fighting unranked fighters to a top 10 fighter and then getting a title shot. That is a huge push. Now, of course, she won the title. The push was successful. So, like I said, she was the example of when the push totally succeeds. Let's look at another one who could be a failure looking at it right now, but the jury is still out. We'll have to see. Macy, the future Barber. Barber comes in, fights short notice Hannah Cifers for her first opponent in the UFC, beats Cifers. Moves up a division, but then faces another fighter who is also moving up a division in JJ Aldrich. Kind of got exposed against Aldrich, but still ends up winning. Then she takes on fringe top 15 fighter Gillian Roberts. Gets ranked off of that win too, I believe. Then she fights fringe top 15 fighter Gillian Robertson. Beats Robertson. Very next fight, she gets a top 10 opponent in Roxanne Modafferi. Roxanne beat the crap out of her, and Barber blew her knee out, tore her ACL in the fight. Barber is out until at least the end of the year, waiting to recover. But in the meantime, She's been completely exposed as not being able to handle someone who can come forward on her and someone who can get outstruck, out-wrestled, out-grappled. I mean, got exposed big time against a fighter, meanwhile, that she was hugely favored to beat, and that casual fans pretty much dismiss out of hand because of the way she looks in Modafferi. Now, granted, hardcore fans know that Modafferi ain't a slouch. But hardcore opinions don't matter. It's the casual opinions. Barbara took a huge L in that loss to Modafferi. So the push might have gotten stopped. I doubt it. UFC seems to like her. We'll have to see when she comes back. As of right now, the jury's still out. Now let's look at another fighter who it's taken a while. It's taken a little longer than most for her to get this push, but she is suddenly getting the big push. Xiaonan. Yan entered the UFC with a 7-1 record. Beats completely unranked and on a losing streak Kylan Curran. Easily handles Curran. Then she fights the also unranked Viviane Pereira. Again, beats her. Then gets another win over Shuri Kondo. I believe each of those three fighters, it was their last fight in the UFC. So they're not really pushing Yan at this point. Then they match her up against Angela Hill. Gets a unanimous decision against Hill. Bit of a controversial decision there. But I think that was the win where they finally noticed, oh, this girl has potential. And she's Chinese. We got another Chinese fighter in the strawweight. It's almost like they forgot that they had her while they focused on Zan. But now they started to show some focus to Yan here. Then she fights Karolina Kowalkiewicz. Kowalkiewicz on the downslope, on a losing streak at the time. 3-fight losing streak. Was on her way out of the top 15. Yan completely destroys her, picking up another decision. So now Yan, I believe she is ranked, let me see. I think she's ranked right now. Pull that up real quick. My apologies, I should have had this up already. So yeah, Yan moves up to she's currently ranked number 10. So she beats one ranked fighter, and because of some other moves in the rankings, gets moved all the way up to number 10. Now, she's going to face Claudia Gadelha. Claudia is currently ranked at number 6. That's a 4-spot rankings move, potentially, here for her. Because you notice if she beats Claudia, they're automatically going to make her number 6, even though she hasn't beaten 9 through 7. That's just the way the rankings work in the UFC. You beat someone, it's like, oh, you automatically take her spot, usually. That's a huge push there. Huge push. Beat one ranked fighter, get moved into the top 15. Now you're at number 10. Now you got a chance for number 6. That's a big, big push right there. Not that it's necessarily undeserved, but Yan is largely untested in the UFC. She's mostly fought fighters on losing streaks, and her ground game has not been tested. So, big question marks for her. Another one, the jury is still out. So let's look at a fighter who just tasted defeat for the first time this past weekend. Marina Rodriguez out of Brazil. Rodriguez came in out of the Contender Series. Gets a first round stoppage there. Fights Jessica Aguilar. Gets a decision against Jessica Aguilar. Now Aguilar was on... First she fights Random Marcos. Gets a draw against Marcos. I don't believe Marcos was ranked at the time. Then she gets a win against Jessica Aguilar. Aguilar, I believe, was on a losing streak at the time. She was coming off the loss to Zan. She was 1-1 in her last 2. Beats Aguilar via a decision. She gets moved all the way up into, I think, fringe top 10 maybe just outside the top 10, to fight Tecia Torres. Torres is the one who was like fringe top 10 at the time, because Torres was on a 3-fight losing streak. Gets a decision against Torres. So now they had her at number 9 off of only one ranked win. Moved her all the way up to number 9. They give her a spot. They give her a chance to move up 2 spots against Carla Esparza. Gets, well, honestly, her ground game, or lack of ground game rather, was already exposed against Calvillo and Torres. I'm sorry, I forgot to mention that she got another draw against Cynthia Calvillo when they tried to move her up the rankings before. Calvillo's no longer in the strawweight rankings. I missed that grade D, the draw, because it's a different shade. So she beats one fringe top 10 fighter, gets a draw against another. They're still trying to push her forward, and gives her a chance against the number 7 fighter, Carla Esparza. Gets completely exposed for lack of a ground game. So now you have a fighter who was pushed into the top 10 and has 0 ground game. The verdict is still out on Rodriguez, but it does not look good, because now she has been exposed so hard that every fighter in there, they're not even going to bother striking with her, because what would be the point? Not necessarily that they're scared of her, but what would be the point of trying to stand with her when they know her ground game is that bad? Every future opponent of hers is probably going to try to take her down. So now you got a top 10 fighter, number 9, can't defend takedowns, can't get off of her back. That's a bad push right there. That's an example of a bad push. Verdict is still out over whether or not she can come back or continue to improve. But as far as the push goes, that was a bad push right there. Now finally you have one, and I'm going to get a lot of hate for this, because she is everyone's sweetheart right now. Amanda Ribas. Ribas comes into the UFC with a 6-1 record. Beats Emily Whitmire. Whitmire is like the bottom of the strawweight division. Nothing against Whitmire, but that's what she is. Beats Whitmire, submits her in the 2nd round. Then she comes out and outboxes Mackenzie Dern. Okay, Mackenzie Dern can't strike for crap. And Mackenzie Dern is only hyped, and I'm going to get hate on for this too. For all her jiu-jitsu credentials, the real reason Mackenzie Dern is hyped is because of her body. Because she has a set of knockers on her. That's why Mackenzie Dern is hyped, more than anything. More than her undefeated record up to that point. More than her jiu-jitsu credentials, she's hyped because she has boobs. Ribas outboxes Dern comfortably to a unanimous decision. So you got 2 unranked fighters she beats. Then she beats a 3rd unranked fighter in Randa Marcos. Marcos, who consistently inconsistent, win-loss, win-loss, win-loss. She gets matched up with Randa Marcos, who was coming off of a win at the time. That's practically a guaranteed win for Ribas. Now granted, she dominated Randa Marcos in a way that I don't think anyone else in the UFC has. All credit to Ribas for that. But then she starts campaigning for and finally gets a fight against Paige Vanzant at flyweight. Oh, Ribas got moved into the top 15 off of that win over Randa Marcos. She got moved up to like number 14. 3 wins in a row. Okay, I can kind of understand putting her in the rankings after 3 wins in a row, but there are other fighters that have gotten 3 wins in a row against unranked fighters and didn't get ranked. Xiaonan didn't get ranked after 3 wins. Angela Hill didn't get ranked after multiple wins in a row, but they'll do it for Ribas. So now Ribas actually gets moved up 2 spots after beating Paige Vanzant at flyweight. She goes up to a weight class, takes a fight outside the weight class, beats a fighter that she was a huge favorite against, beats a fighter that nobody was given a chance against Amanda. Gets moved up 2 spots to number 12. Now she starts calling out the winner of Esparza versus Rodriguez. So you're at number 12 and you're calling out the winner at number 7. And the UFC seems keen to give it to her. It's like, whoa, slow your roll. You haven't even beaten a ranked fighter yet, and you're trying to get a top 10 win. You're trying to get into those top 10 fights already. It's like, how about beating a fighter who actually has a number next to their name first before you get a top 10 fight? I mean, I understand. Look, hey, call out higher ranked fighters all you want, but it's like you're calling out number 7 when you haven't even beaten someone who was ranked as high as 15. That's a little much. Like I said, I'm going to get a lot of crap for this, but she's getting a huge push and it's super obvious. Okay, so those are my 6 examples of fighters who are getting that big push. Now, my personal thought is that I'm okay with big pushes as long as they're deserved. But when you're getting moved up the rankings like 3, 4, 5 slots at a time, and over other fighters who have fought for longer and harder than you have, and they're not getting the same opportunities, I'm not a big fan of that. So if the push is deserved, I'm fine with it. But if you're not really getting wins deserving of the big push behind you, and you're mostly getting pushed because of the marketing or because you got a bit of charisma, I'm not a big fan. I'm more for, earning your way to the top. I'm old-fashioned like that. I believe in a meritocracy. I realize this is prize fighting. It's not always about merit. But I'm just not a fan of these big, undeserved pushes and constant moves up the rankings. I'm just not. But I'd like to hear your thoughts on them. So let me know in the comments down below. If you like the video, please give it a like and share it on your social media. Spread the word. And hey, what are you waiting for? Subscribe to WMMA Scene Now, the most complete women's mixed martial arts dedicated platform on YouTube. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.